All right, with us today is Neville Ellis, who is not located in the United States. Neville, tell folks where you're located and where you're doing your research.
Well, I'm located in Perth, Western Australia, which is located on the southwestern tip of the Australian continent. And I'm doing my research, or I've just finished my research, looking at climate change and mental health impacts amongst farmers in the West Australian wheat belt.
Let's start first a little bit about your climate and what your weather is like, and what's going on, and what maybe prompted this type of research.
Yeah, sure. So the weather over here is known as a meta over here. So we've got quite hot, dry summers and cool, wet winters. And it's during the cool, wet winters when farmers will plant the crops, and the growing season will extend from May through to October in that cool, wet part of the year. What's been happening recently, however, is that we've experienced a significant drying trend, winter drying trend, since the 1970s. So the West Australian wheat belt was once renowned as having the most reliable winter climates in Australia for broadacre agriculture. However, what we see today is something quite different. Not only have we lost upwards of 1/3 of our winter rainfall in parts of the West Australian wheat belt, but we've also seen conditions become much more variable as well. So that's in terms of rainfall falling at different times of the year, or not falling when it should be, more extreme weather events. But we're also getting more extreme temperatures as well. So heat waves, and paradoxically with more frosts as well. So, and the other thing that your listeners need to know also about this part of the world is that this trend, this drying trend, this change in the climate hasn't been linear. The drying trend started in the 1970s and gradually got worse up until about 2000. And from 2000 onwards, things have intensified rather dramatically. In fact, things have got so dry over here that Perth's dams, so that's the major city over here, no longer supply water to the Perth metro area. We've seen so much drying, in fact, that we're now completely dependent upon desalination and groundwater reserves. So that gives you an indication to the extent we've experienced a drying climate over here. And our farmers, because they're 100% dependent upon seasonal rainfall, are on the leading edge of climate change risk in this part of the country.
When you look at the weather trends, and you mentioned it increased from the 70s to the 2000s, and we've seen a substantial increase since the 2000s. A lot of your research has been on how that weather and the change in the climate, or climate change, has affected farmers' mental health. So as we look at that, what were some of the things that you saw that maybe prompted this type of research?
Well, to give a little bit of background, I guess you could sort of call me an environmental psychologist of sorts. I'm interested in how the environment affects people's emotional well-being and their psychological health. And so what we're seeing is that in different parts of the world, climate change is really starting to have an adverse impact on the mental health and well-being of people who retain close living and working relationships to the land. Most of this research has been conducted amongst Indigenous populations. For example, there's been research come out of Canada over the last few years, which has looked at climate change and mental health impacts. As you can imagine, the Inuit are people who have got very strong cultural, living, working relationships to land, but their landscape is one that's changing quite rapidly because of global warming and climate change. The sea ice is melting, the permafrost is melting, and it's causing all sorts of problems within the community, and also presenting all sorts of mental health risks. Now, here in Australia, we've got this huge farming population that are also exposed to these climate risks. And even though there has been research looking at climate change and potential health mental health impacts amongst our farmers, there hasn't really been a great deal of research done in this area, particularly from the way that I approach it, which is to look at climate change impacts on farmers' sense of place and mental well-being. So sense of place being people's emotional and psychological relationships to the land. And my big question was, well, if you're a person that's heavily invested emotionally and psychologically in that land, and that land is starting to degrade or be damaged by a changing climate, what does that do to your emotional health and your psychological well-being?
As we look at your research in Australia, how do or what can farmers and people in the United States, you look at California that's been suffering from a severe drought for many years, and you look at the Midwest, 2012, the drought here in the Corn Belt, how can or what do American farmers and maybe American researchers take from the research that you've been doing?
Well, there's a few things that farmers and mental health practitioners can take away, I think. One of the first things, and this is directed towards farmers, is to be able to explain to farmers, I guess, the climate change risks presented to them. I don't know what it's like in the US, but here there's a certain level of uncertainty, if not skepticism, about the whole idea of human-caused climate change. And I think there's this uncertainty also feeds into uncertainty about the future. So farmers here, for example, have observed these big changes in their local climates over the last few years, but farmers are scratching their heads going, well, is this a cycle? Is it going to get better next year, or is this something that's going to continue on into the future? I mean, we just don't know. So those climate change messages aren't being communicated very well to our farmers over here. So one of the first things I would be saying to key agricultural government departments is that you need to be able to communicate climate change risks better to the farmers that are being affected. The second thing I would say, and this is off on a big tangent here, and again, I don't know how farms are structured in different parts of America, but over here in our broad acre regions, what you find is that the house in which the farming family lives is situated right in the middle of the farm. And when you're inside the house, you can quite clearly see the paddocks, the farm, and the rest of the environment very clearly. And when it's green and lush, it's absolutely beautiful. But over here, because we've got this drying trend, more and more, the landscape has a tendency to dry out and become very vulnerable to wind erosion and other forms of degradation. And you can imagine that if you're a farmer and your whole life is wrapped up in that land, that's heartbreaking to see your land degrade like that. And it's even more heartbreaking if you go back home and go inside the house and you can still quite clearly see your land being degraded, your land blow away. So one of the things that came from my research was that because there's a very little geographical lack of separation between the farm and the home environment, there's also very little psychological separation between the farm and the home environment. And what I would be encouraging farmers to do is to plant a garden or a green buffer zone around their house. So if things become degraded and become intolerable outside, that you have somewhere, a refuge to come home to. Because there are instances with the farmers that I was talking to where they were getting wind erosion, dust storms, and there's nothing to buffer them against that. They're coming home and the dust is coming in through the front door. You know, it's very emotionally distressing. And so that's where I think this idea of a buffer zone, it's just a really simple, practical idea that farmers can choose to employ. And the third thing I would be saying too, this is directed towards mental health practitioners, is don't underestimate the power of farmers' sense of place and the importance of their sense of place for their mental health and well-being. Over here, we found farmers willing to incur a great level of financial and emotional hardship to be able to stay on their land, even when it looked like they had no hope of financially recovering from their position. And you also see, or what nurses and doctors were saying to me, was that when the land becomes distressed, you can certainly see distressed farmers. And that's not just only because their financial positions are being eroded by these sorts of weather conditions, but also because the farm is a big part of their emotional life as well. So again, if that land becomes degraded, you see many more stressed out farmers. And so mental health practitioners need to be aware of this relationship that farmers have with their land, and that relationship that exists between the health of their land and their own mental health and well-being.
Would you liken it to maybe like a seasonal affect disorder, but maybe intensified greatly because there is no escape from what they're seeing every day?
Well, it's interesting that you raise that notion of seasonal affective disorder, because one of the doctors that I spoke to servicing these rural communities likened it to a seasonal affective disorder. A seasonal affective disorder that was born out of a lack of rainfall rather than a lack of sunlight. And so he was saying that he could quite clearly see this pattern of distress amongst farmers, particularly going into seeding, where they're obviously having to make some very big financial decisions, they're working very long hours, and they're keeping an eye on the rain at this point in time. But with our drying climate, the rain just hasn't been falling. And so those stress levels really build at this time of year. And he was seeing this happening year after year after year. And that's what he called it. He called it a seasonal affective disorder because of this lack of rain. So I think that term certainly holds some water.
Let's talk a little bit about, you mentioned that farms, the way that your farms are structured in Australia, and on an average, what is the average size of a farm in your area?
Well, the area that I was researching, I think the average size was somewhere between, it varied, probably around about 8,000 hectares, I would dare say. Do you operate in hectares or acres in the United States?
We operate in acres.
Oh, okay. I'm not sure how that translates over.
I'll have to do the math, but I think it's like, I don't want to say. I can't remember. It's been a long time in a hectare country.
They're really big farm operations. There was one, for example, farming family that I interviewed, and the father, who was doing most of the work on the farm, he also had a farmhand, and between the land that he owned and the land that he leased, he was operating an area that had the equivalent size of, I think it was 14,000 urban blocks, the average size of urban blocks in Perth. So it's just a staggering area of land.
So they're not small farms. It's not, these aren't your 100, what I would call like 100, 250 acre small farm.
Oh, certainly not. These are big operations, definitely. And you also find that farms in Western Australia tend to be, broadacre farms at least, tend to be bigger here than anywhere else in Australia as well. So they are truly huge. And the further east you go, the bigger they get.
I guess maybe to kind of wrap things up, any alarming statistics that you saw from your research or your research pointed to, anything else that we should know about before we let you go?
Well, because I did qualitative research, I can't point to statistics. I was more looking at farmers' lived experiences of climate change. There are a couple of things I'd like to add if we've got time. There's this term that was invented by my supervisor called solastalgia. And what solastalgia refers to is this sense of being homesick while still being at home. And this term is being used greatly in the climate change community to talk about some of the emotional and psychological impacts of a changing climate on people's mental health and well-being. Now, solastalgia it sounds like nostalgia, doesn't it? But it's different. Nostalgia is what you feel when you're separated from a loved home environment. Maybe you've moved away from it. You've become homesick because you've been separated from a place that you know, you love, and you cherish. Solastalgia talks about this in-place sense of distress or grief when you're living in this environment that you love and you're witnessing it degrade or transform in a way that you find distressing. And so what I found here is that our farms have become, or seem to have become, more vulnerable to dust storm events. And as I was talking about beforehand, you know, the farm is so much more than just a business. It's a way of life. It's a sense of identity. It's that continuation of family heritage. And if you've got wind erosion on your land, farmers see that as their own personal failings. They see themselves as bad farmers when that happens. Now, going back to what I was talking about beforehand with this lack of separation between the home and the farm environment, what I found was that farmers' wives were having to drag their husbands indoors, sit them down in front of a movie, close all the windows, all the curtains, and block them off from an outside world that had become far too distressing to watch. I even found a female farmer who would take to putting herself to bed and putting the doona over her head so she couldn't see what was happening outside. She found it so distressing. And that is a classic example of this notion of solastalgia, this homesickness that one feels while still being at home. So I thought I'd just add that in at the end there, because that's something that's been, that people have found interesting from this research and something that people could relate to. If we've got, do we have one more minute?
Yes, you have all the time.
Okay, fantastic. One other thing, and this might be interesting for to see whether farmers in the United States are experiencing this, but because our climate has become a lot more variable and a lot dry over recent years too, we've seen that our farmers have lost confidence in the predictability of the weather. And what that means is two things. One, farmers feel as though that they have no idea what's coming next year, next month, next week. And the other thing I found was that farmers' forecast checking behaviours have almost taken on a pathological bent, I guess, where I found some farmers were getting their phones out, checking 5 or 6 weather forecasts 10, 15 times a day. They literally will track storm systems as they emerge out of the Indian Ocean and as they sweep across the West Australian wheat belt. What's been happening, however, is they see these storm systems coming and their hopes and expectations rise. And the closer they get, the more the hope rises, their expectation rises. But then right at the end, just before they arrive, these storm systems will dissipate, break up and disappear. And that's one of the biggest letdowns that farmers that I talked to had felt. This almost emotional roller coaster ride of this boom bust cycle of hope and despair was really quite grinding for farmers to experience. I don't know if that's something that farmers in the United States can relate to, but certainly farmers here are much more sensitive to the weather, I think, than what they were beforehand. And also this weather checking behaviour can cause a lot of stress as well.
I would compare it very much to 2012. And as a farmer's daughter who works with my farm back home in Illinois, one state over, I went through the same thing. I have 3 or 4 weather apps on my phone and constantly watching storm systems move in and break up and just basically split around the Corn Belt. It was a really tough.
Right.
It was really tough for farmers in 2012, and then we had a year this year where there were farms in Indiana and farms in the Midwest that had mass amounts of rain and a lot of flooding damage too. So I know there's farmers in Southwest Indiana that lost 500 to 1,000 acres of corn from flooding. So I think that parallels wherever you are and wherever you farm.
Well, we call, me and my supervisor call that worry about the weather meteor anxiety. We've given it a name so we can direct people's attention to it. This constant and chronic, persistent worry about the weather, and yeah, I guess it's the same for any farmer, isn't it? That whose livelihoods and lifestyles and cultures are dependent upon the weather.
One quick thing, or one quick question, just as we're talking about weather, in comparisons to where we are. My weather this morning is cold and snowy here in the Midwest, and you told me your weather is what?
Well, I don't know exactly what the conversion rate is, but it's 42 degrees Celsius over here. So that's, I think it's around about 110 degrees Fahrenheit, if not more, and we're experiencing a week of it. So this is our longest heat or February heat wave since 1933, I think it is. Yesterday was 42 degrees as well, and tomorrow will be 40 degrees. So well, yeah, it's staggering how different it is.
Yes, yes, it is. I appreciate your time and your ability to make this work, so we could talk a little bit about this.
Oh well, thank you very much for your time, and yeah, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you very much.
Have a great evening.
You too. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.